Well, I have to begin by thanking the Heritage Council and ICOMOS Ireland for this kind invitation. And I have to continue very quickly by congratulating both organizations for the great work that they do. The Heritage Council, of course, here in Ireland, providing the spinal support that is absolutely necessary to conserve the rich heritage that you have, that you treasure, and that you also generously share with the rest of the world. And ICOMOS Ireland for the extraordinary work it does, not in Ireland so much, although I realize that that's considerable, but also in supporting the international aims of ICOMOS throughout Europe and throughout the world. I also want to congratulate Colin Murray for the organization and the vision that he has had in developing this program that will guide us through today. The query that brings us together is one gathering importance all over the world, and it is understanding the ever stronger links that bind heritage resources, sustainable development, and community participation. I thought it would be appropriate to begin with what I believe to be the earliest recognition of a heritage place and of the need to preserve it. And it dates from the year 480 BC, when the Athenians as a community took the oath of Plataea and swore to forever preserve in place the ruins of the Acropolis as a permanent reminder of the destructive powers of their sworn enemies, the Persians, and their resolve that it would never happen again. It is perhaps the earliest recorded example of a community coming together to make such decisions regarding their heritage. Of course, we know now that the Oath of Plataea was not really kept, and the Acropolis, in fact, was reconstructed. But in the process of reconstruction, the memory was kept. The will of the people was kept. And in one example that you see in the photograph on the left is the wall of the early destruction that still sits under the Erechtheion, and on the right, the north wall, which incorporates the drums of the columns in the old Parthenon. So memories do linger, and the will of the people does prevail. Community participation has become a common banner for all recent heritage work, but the fact is that it has been an integral part of heritage conservation since its genesis. As shown by the Athenian example, the concept of a patrimony that is commonly shared and owned, at least morally, if not outright, by all society, has existed since classical antiquity and down through the ages. But its roots, in the context of our work in the modern perception of heritage, dates from the early 19th century, particularly in the aftermath of the French Revolution, with the nationalization by the state of all properties that had belonged to the church, to the crown, and to the emigrant nobility, which suddenly rendered the French people as owners and heirs of a vast communal set of properties that would be stewarded on their behalf by the state. In spite of the negative associations of these places with centuries of abuse that precipitated the revolution, the concept of public ownership resonated among the French people, especially as the meaning of this conglomerate of properties was politically cleansed by being effectively reinterpreted for the public not as the legacy of oppressive autocracies and oligarchies, but as the product of French national genius. It was brilliant. So it's all about packaging, and Neil is good about that, about interpretation and telling us how heritage can be presented in many different ways. Without having to go into any great historical detail, it is valid to assert that this revolutionary concept of heritage as communal property of the nation began to take root all over Europe and eventually all over the world. And as it took hold, it justified the attribution of enormous powers to government to acquire properties perceived to be of national significance on behalf of its people and to regulate large inventories of privately held properties. But public recognition of a shared heritage must be preserved is one thing, and it is an entirely different thing to figure out how to use it and preserve it. As Alois Riegel advanced in his 1903 work, The Modern Cult of Monuments, it all comes down to values, and I think Connor spoke about that, so you did steal my thunder too. I think that's what we do. That's why it's important to be first or last. Anyway, the use and treatment of heritage places, or of any physical object for that matter, are a direct function of the values attributed to it, or in other words, what a place or an object means and the memories it contains. The origins of modern heritage conservation as we know it today are rooted in the cognitive and aesthetic values that were shared by the intellectual and economic elites who felt empowered to attribute artistic and historic significance to the material relics of the past in the name of all society. Thus, for more than a century and a half, until very recently, these increasingly specialized epistemic elites appropriated the responsibility to make all decisions regarding heritage, including defining what places were heritage, the reasons why they are heritage and why they're significant, which material elements carry that significance, that is, the vessels of value, and the treatment that they would receive and how their significance would be presented to the rightful owner, the general public. Despite these broad powers, heritage specialists never lost sight of the fact that retention of their authority relied entirely on governmental acceptance of their right to speak and act on behalf of the people. And for that reason, as well as to secure greater political support and larger budgets for heritage conservation, it became their common mantra, I should say our common mantra, to call for the embracing of heritage conservation by the general public as a core element of national policy. After decades of repeating this and grinding this in every forum that we could find, lo and behold, the public heard it and digested this message, and we're now witnessing their appropriation of the heritage that for so many years they were told was rightly theirs, but at the same time was kept at arm's length from them. While this is perceived as a triumph by most conservators, and definitely by ICOMOS, at least under my leadership, it is also seen by a small minority of preservation specialists as a Trojan horse, in that in appropriating their heritage, communities are eroding the traditional authority of specialists by demanding participation in the decision-making process regarding what their heritage is and how it is to be used. This disgruntled use of specialists fear that they're losing their preeminent role to become one more stakeholder community. In my view, this revolutionary turnover of power is a good thing, and it is a view that is shared by many, especially in democratically governed nations. And here, very much so in Ireland, proof of which is that we're here to figure out more effective and constructive ways to engage and empower communities as full participants in the heritage process. However, as we will see a little later, the fear of the Trojan horse may not be entirely unfounded, because while a lot has been gained, there is always the looming danger that something may be lost too. At the international level, the right of stakeholder communities to speak up and the obligation of government and heritage specialists to listen was first codified in the Borough Charter developed in the 1970s and 80s by the ICOMOS National Committee of Australia and revised twice since then. The impact of the Borough Charter throughout the world cannot be exaggerated. In China, it provided the framework for the adoption of the China Principles. Major institutions such as English Heritage and the Getty Conservation Institute have adopted it as their working methodology. Throughout Latin America, it has fostered greater regard for community input. And in the United States, it has reinforced the traditional participation of the public in heritage decisions, which allegedly was the original inspiration of the Borough Charter. The embracing of community participation has also penetrated deeply into the context of the World Heritage Convention. The original 3 C's of the global strategy, which were credibility, conservation, and capacity building, adopted by the World Heritage Committee at its meeting in 1994, and later expanded by a 4th one, communication, in 2007 at the instigation of New Zealand, added the 5th, which is community. By empowering communities, the Borough Charter and its global ripple effect has also ushered in a new range of values that only rarely in the past had been used as justification for heritage designation. to the traditional, historic, and aesthetic values that were and remain the domain of educated, specialized elites, and that were so eloquently explained in the Venice Charter of 1964, Bora added the new currency that consists of social use and commemorative values that all communities attribute to their immediate everyday environment, but that so often has been ignored or at best considered secondary in importance. In addition to the democratizing effect inherent in recognizing the role of public opinion, Bora has also had the effect of establishing a new paradigm in which the values of heritage do not necessarily reside in the physical elements of the place, but also in certain intangible concepts such as communal memory, spiritual beliefs, communal rituals, cultural identity, and traditional use of the public space. Since materials can be physically conserved, but intangible aspects and concepts cannot, the heritage field has had to grapple with the challenge to transcend from an exclusive focus of conserving materials into the much broader one of managing change that emanates from other concerns. The right of communities to decide on a proper utilitarian purpose in society was recognized always by the heritage community and is embedded as early as 1964 in the Venice Charter. But Bora took it much further by indirectly establishing an inextricable link between heritage and development as perceived by the stakeholding communities. Concerns for community participation as a sine qua non for the integration of heritage and sustainable development has always been present also, at first in very latent form, but more recently in more outright and explicit ways. In 2003, the Netherlands Commission for UNESCO convened a conference on linking universal and local values, and the subtitle for that conference was Managing a Sustainable Future for World Heritage. The proceedings for that conference were later published by the World Heritage Center as number 13 in the World Heritage Paper Series, and it's available on their website. The introduction to this volume provides a good summary of the party line of UNESCO and even the entire United Nations system in this respect by saying that the World Heritage Committee seeks to ensure an appropriate and equitable balance between conservation, sustainability, and development, so that World Heritage properties can be protected through appropriate activities contributing to the social and economic development and the quality of life of communities, and will seek to ensure the active involvement of local communities at all levels in the identification, protection, and management of all World Heritage properties. And it is important, I think, at this point to make a small parenthesis that World Heritage properties are meant to be not the aristocracy of heritage, but the example that should be followed by the rest of heritage. Therefore, the fact that a place never makes it to be World Heritage does not mean that it does not merit the equal protection that World Heritage sites deserve. The question often is posed as to what constitutes a valid stakeholder communities, and the World Heritage Committee's resolution in the Christchurch meeting are useful in clarifying that the term communities involves all forms of non-state actors in whichever form they manifest themselves. They may range from groupings of people as indigenous, traditional, and or local peoples. They may be presented as inter alia community groups, tribes, non-governmental organizations, distant diasporic groups, private enterprise, and local authorities. The defining characteristics of all these communities in this setting is what they all possess, which is an indirect connection to the heritage properties with relevant interests that often have been maintained over long periods of time. Usually, but not necessarily always, these communities share a close proximity with the site in question. And these people and entities are not necessarily directly representing official state positions. In fact, they may actually be in dissent from official positions. Writing about community involvement in tourism development in Macau, Jenny Obdenkamp has highlighted that cultural heritage is part of the narrative around which a community creates a sense of identity and ownership. However, she also rightly points out that such familiarity and immediacy can bring about a decrease of local awareness of the intrinsic values of heritage properties, especially as perceived by outsiders and erudite groups. Involving communities in decision-making processes can help align local and external values and empower them to present the fullness of the communal knowledge bank to the outside world. This is indeed a wonderful but perhaps idealistic assessment because, in fact, at times, decision-making by communities in search of economic development can pose some threats to the sustainability of conservation. At this point, I think it might be useful to backtrack a bit, and we can begin by the definition offered for cultural heritage by Wikipedia, which is our new ultimate authority. And it says that cultural heritage is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations. I think it's also a good idea to recall the definition of sustainable development, and the most frequently quoted definition is from the 1987 report, Our Common Future, published by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which is known more commonly as the Brundtland Report. And it states that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In these last two slides, I have underlined the portion of the text that refers to our responsibilities to future generations. While this concept acquired prominence as a result of the Brundtland Report and the summit meeting in Rio, it has been at the very core of the ethical concept of what constitutes good conservation since the start of our work so many generations ago. That is the reason why we see ourselves as temporary stewards and not as owners of the heritage from the past. Our obsession with protecting authenticity and integrity is directly related to the intergenerational transmission so that we may give our descendants what we got from our ancestors in the same condition that we received it. Many of the radical alterations that heritage is undergoing today is directly linked to the welcoming of communities to express their current needs and to make decisions on how heritage should be used to meet them. Most of them, of course, are linked to economics, and some of those only do temporary damage, such as the current epidemic that you see here on the use of historic buildings as commercial billboards when they're under restoration, allegedly to generate additional revenue for their conservation. Other approaches, however, can cause permanent harm. When community makes these decisions, they must know that any reduction in authenticity and integrity by our generation means reducing the knowledge about heritage and the options for its use by all next generations into the future. In other ways, we may be enriching ourselves at the expense of impoverishing our descendants. For instance, a facadism project done during our time to make certain heritage buildings more usable in today's society means that the next generation and all subsequent generations will forever have lost the building itself. All they will have is the screen that faces the public space. When you stop to think about it and the number of facadism projects going on today in the entire world, this is a severe loss that our generation is inflicting on the next. This, then, is a good time to return to the three C's, or the 5 C's, of the World Heritage Global Strategy, and more specifically, to the third C, which is capacity building. When we think of capacity building, we must think beyond training more heritage specialists, which of course is an ongoing obligation. We have to continue to train them. But with the advent of sharing authorities and decision-making with communities, we think we need to think more about capacity building, not so much for specialists, but for the communities themselves. The fact that specialists were in charge for so long was no accident, nor was it a secret plot to seize authority over the public domain. The reason we had and still have authority is that we have been trained to understand heritage, to weigh the consequences of our actions, and to take the right decisions in a way that they meet the test of sustainability and our intergenerational obligations. We have been trained to be guardians of heritage, not only for those who are living today, but also to defend the heritage interests of those who are yet to come. If communities are to take over these responsibilities, they need to have the capacity to do the same, which requires investments in terms of time to research and to understand the contentious issues that affect heritage, which here includes such sensitive topics as peat extractions in the bogs and the potential contamination from fracking in the rivers and lands that surround a number of your tentative list properties in Ireland. To begin drawing conclusions, I would like to share with you the 5 ascending levels that IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is our partner organization in World Heritage, that they have suggested for community involvement. Attaining the highest levels will be entirely dependent on the readiness of communities to acquire the knowledge necessary to discharge these responsibilities. At the lowest level, and it's a very common one throughout the world today, is just providing information to groups or individuals about proposed actions, but without the opportunity to change decisions. Next comes consultation, whereby information is given and the views of those consulted are sought. Third is deciding together, which builds upon the above 2 steps, with the relevant stakeholders being part of the final decision-making process within established boundaries of influence. Acting together is the next, where there is both shared decision-making and shared responsibility for implementing decision. And finally, in the brave new world that we are coming to, is supporting independent community interests, where communities become responsible for setting their own agendas and implementing the decisions which are taken. The role of experts, our role in the future, will be to support the community with information and expertise and perhaps resources to help them make informed decisions. Several years ago, I heard a story, or I read about a story, which was actually a cautionary tale. It took place in the state of Georgia in the United States, where a community was torn between saving a very well-loved historic site or building a cloverleaf ramp that would, in the freeway that would shorten their daily commute. It was decided that to solve the problem, a referendum would be held. And indeed, the cloverleaf won. And we lost that historic site. That may be the democratic way, but maybe not so if we realize that one group of stakeholders was not allowed to vote, and that would be the group of the next generation that would have inherited the site. And this is precisely what sustainability is all about, being guardians of the estate of our children and grandchildren. Only an educated and responsible community can do that. And of course, I bring this up because it echoes the similar event that we heard about in the bypass at Slane, and also that has been discussed regarding Tara, that's been discussed in terms of Stonehenge and in so many other places. Events such as this will continue to happen in Ireland and everywhere. Your tentative list features properties where development and conservation of the property and its context will need discussion and resolutions of many conflicts that will arise. One such place, for instance, is the rock in Cashel, where the proximity of the rock to the living town is a relationship that periodically will pit the interest of one against the other. And perhaps even more delicate in Cashel will be the way that the significant cultural landscape that surrounds the place on the opposite side of town is being dotted with residential as well as with light industrial use. It's really kind of ominous. It's not serious yet, but it could become serious. Even among communities that are well educated, or I should say especially among communities that are well educated and concerned about heritage, conflicts will continue to occur, such as in Dublin, especially if it becomes a World Heritage City. But as I said, regardless of whether Dublin is a World Heritage City or not, will not diminish its importance and will not diminish the obligation to protect it. So I think one should bear that in mind. World Heritage is a footnote, it's not the headline. These are not easy choices. If they were, we would not be here today, and I probably wouldn't have a job. Thank you.